In the dust-choked town of Cedar Falls, Colorado, where death knocked on every door and hope had withered like autumn leaves, Sheriff Thomas Mitchell stood at his office window watching another funeral procession wind its way toward Boot Hill. The fever had claimed 3 more souls overnight, bringing the total death count to 47 in just 2 months. His left sleeve, pinned neatly where his arm used to be, fluttered in the hot September wind that carried nothing but the stench of sickness and despair. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Thomas pressed his remaining hand against the glass, feeling the weight of his failures settle deeper into his shoulders. At 35, he had already buried 2 wives to this cursed plague that had descended upon their once thriving mining town. The first had been consumption, quick and merciless. The second, just 3 weeks ago, had succumbed to the same mysterious fever that was now devouring Cedar Falls from the inside out. Doc Henley had fled town a month ago, claiming he was needed elsewhere. But Thomas knew the truth. The old physician had run out of answers, out of hope, and out of courage. Now the nearest doctor was 2 days' ride through Apache territory, and most folks were too sick to make the journey, even if they had the money for treatment. The morning sun beat down mercilessly on Cedar Falls as Thomas made his rounds through the main street, his boots echoing hollowly on the wooden boardwalk. The town that had once bustled with miners, merchants, and families now resembled a ghost town populated by the walking dead. Storefront windows stared back at him like vacant eyes, many bearing hastily scrawled signs, closed due to sickness or simply gone to Denver. Martha's general store remained open, though barely. The elderly proprietress herself was pale and shaking, clearly fighting off the early stages of the fever that had already claimed her husband. She nodded weakly as Thomas entered, the bell above the door sounding unnaturally loud in the oppressive quiet. "Morning, Sheriff," Martha wheezed, clutching the counter for support. "Got your mail here, came in on yesterday's stage." Thomas accepted the small bundle of letters with his good hand, noting how Martha's fingers trembled as she handed them over. Among the usual notices from the territorial government and a letter from his sister in Kansas City, one envelope caught his attention. The return address bore the name of a correspondence agency in Chicago, and the handwriting was distinctly feminine. "You ordered yourself a bride, Sheriff?" Martha asked with the ghost of a smile, the first he'd seen from anyone in weeks. Thomas felt heat rise in his cheeks. 3 months ago, in a moment of desperation and loneliness following his second wife's death, he had indeed written to the Heartland Marriage Bureau. The letter had been composed late at night, aided by whiskey and the crushing realization that he was entirely alone in a dying town. He had described himself honestly, a one-armed sheriff in a frontier town, seeking a woman of good character who could help him rebuild what the fever had destroyed. "Might have," he admitted, tucking the letter into his vest pocket. "Though I figured no sensible woman would answer." "Well, seems one did," Martha observed, before another coughing fit seized her. When she recovered, her expression had grown serious. "Sheriff, my grandson Billy took sick in the night. Started with the shaking, then the fever. His ma's beside herself with worry." Thomas felt the familiar knot of helplessness tighten in his stomach. Billy Henshaw was only 8 years old, bright as a new penny, and one of the few children left in town whose laughter could still be heard on occasion. The thought of losing him to this plague made Thomas's jaw clench with rage at his own powerlessness. "I'll check on them later," he promised, though they both knew there was little he could do beyond offering comfort and false hope. Outside Martha's store, Thomas paused to read the letter from Chicago. The paper was fine quality, and the handwriting was educated, flowing in elegant loops across the cream-colored stationery. "Dear Mr. Mitchell, your letter to our agency has been forwarded to me, and after much consideration, I have decided to accept your proposal of correspondence with the intention of marriage. My name is Sarah Elizabeth Watson, and I am 26 years of age, originally from Boston but currently residing in Chicago. I must be forthright about my circumstances. I am not a woman of means, nor do I possess the typical accomplishments expected of wives in more civilized territories. However, I'm educated, hardworking, and possess certain skills that may prove valuable in a frontier community. I have experience in caring for the sick and injured, having served as a nurse during the recent troubles in the East. If you are still of a mind to welcome a wife to Cedar Falls, I am prepared to make the journey at once. I require only passage, money, and your assurance that the arrangement described in your letter remains acceptable to you. I await your response with cautious optimism. Most respectfully, Sarah Elizabeth Watson Thomas read the letter twice, his heart hammering against his ribs. A nurse. The woman claimed to have experience caring for the sick. In his desperation, 3 months ago, he had mentioned the town's struggles with illness, but he had never dared hope that Providence might send someone with actual medical knowledge. He looked up and down the nearly deserted main street, counting the buildings that showed signs of life. The saloon remained open, though its usual crowd had dwindled to a handful of die-hard drinkers who seemed determined to pickle themselves. Beyond the reach of fever, the blacksmith's forge still glowed, operated by old Pete Garrison, who claimed his daily consumption of whiskey made him immune to disease. The hotel maintained minimal operations under the management of Mrs. Rodriguez, a sturdy woman from New Mexico who had thus far escaped the plague's touch. But everywhere else, Thomas saw the evidence of Cedar Falls' slow death. Windows boarded up, signs askew, weeds growing where once there had been carefully tended flower boxes. The town needed a miracle, and perhaps Sarah Elizabeth Watson was the answer to prayers he hadn't realized he'd been making. Thomas made his way to the small telegraph office, one of the few businesses still operating normally thanks to the dedication of operator Jim Bradley, a grizzled former cavalry sergeant who seemed constitutionally incapable of abandoning his post. "Need to send a wire to Chicago, Jim," Thomas announced, pulling out his wallet to count the meager bills inside. "Chicago? That's gonna cost you, Sheriff. Rates went up last week." Thomas nodded, knowing that his savings were nearly depleted, from paying for medicines that didn't work and coffins that did. Still, if there was even a chance that this woman could help save Cedar Falls, the expense would be worthwhile. "Miss Watson, stop proposal accepted. Stop passage money follows. Stop town, desperate need medical knowledge. Stop, come quickly. Stop, Thomas Mitchell, Cedar Falls, Colorado. Stop." As Jim tapped out the message on his telegraph key, Thomas felt a mixture of anticipation and terror. What was he doing, asking a complete stranger to journey into what amounted to a plague town? What if she took one look at Cedar Falls and climbed back on the first stage heading east? What if she fell ill herself? But then he thought of little Billy Henshaw burning with fever, and of Martha struggling to keep her store open while fighting off sickness herself. He thought of the empty houses and the growing cemetery, and he knew he had to try every option available, no matter how desperate or unlikely. The next 2 weeks passed with agonizing slowness. Thomas continued his daily rounds, checking on the sick, maintaining what order he could in a town that was steadily losing its grip on civilization. 3 more residents died, including Martha's grandson Billy, whose funeral Thomas attended with a heart heavy as lead. Mrs. Rodriguez at the hotel had agreed to prepare a room for Sarah Watson, though she had raised an eyebrow at the arrangement. "You sure about this, Sheriff? Marrying a woman sight unseen, could be anyone coming on that stage." Thomas had no good answer for her concerns, because they mirrored his own doubts exactly. But desperation made men do foolish things, and if Folly was what it took to save Cedar Falls. Then he would embrace it wholeheartedly. The morning of Sarah's expected arrival dawned clear and hot, with the kind of relentless sunshine that seemed to mock the suffering below. Thomas had spent extra time grooming himself, using his good hand to shave carefully and slick back his brown hair with pomade. His badge was polished, his shirt pressed, and his boots shined to the best of his one-handed ability. The stagecoach was due at noon, assuming it hadn't been delayed by road conditions or Apache raids. Thomas positioned himself on the hotel porch at 11:30, trying to appear casual, while his stomach churned with nervous energy. What would she look like? What would she think of him, of the town, of the situation she was walking into? Mrs. Rodriguez emerged from the hotel, carrying a pitcher of lemonade and 2 glasses. "Figured you might be thirsty while you wait," she said kindly, settling into the rocking chair beside him. "Appreciate it, Elena," Thomas replied, grateful for the company and the distraction. "You nervous, Sheriff?" "Terrified," he admitted, with a rueful laugh. "Haven't felt this anxious since my first day wearing a badge." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Elena Rodriguez was a wise woman who had raised 7 children and buried 2 husbands. Her dark eyes held understanding as she studied Thomas's profile. "What you're doing, it's not crazy, you know. Sometimes desperate times call for desperate measures, and sometimes what looks like desperation is really just faith dressed up in work clothes." Before Thomas could respond to her unexpected wisdom, the sound of approaching hoofbeats and jingling harness reached their ears. The weekly stagecoach rounded the bend at the end of Main Street, its team of 6 horses lathered with sweat and dust from the long journey through the mountains. Thomas stood, his heart hammering so loudly he was certain Eleanor could hear it. The coach drew to a stop in front of the hotel, and driver Cal Peterson climbed down from his perch, stretching his back and calling out his standard arrival announcement. "Cedar Falls, end of the line for today. All passengers departing here." The coach door opened, and Thomas held his breath. A thin man in a rumpled suit emerged first, coughing violently into a handkerchief. Thomas's heart sank, recognizing the sound of the fever's early stages. Behind the sick man came a young woman in a dark blue traveling dress, her auburn hair pinned back beneath a practical bonnet. She was not beautiful in the conventional sense that might grace the pages of a ladies' magazine. Her features were strong rather than delicate, her build sturdy rather than willowy. But there was something in the way she carried herself, a confidence and competence that commanded attention. When she looked around the nearly empty street, her green eyes showed concern rather than fear or disgust. "Miss Watson," Thomas called, stepping forward and removing his hat. She turned toward him, and he saw her gaze take in his missing arm, his badge, and his face in quick assessment. "Sheriff Mitchell, I presume." Her voice was clear and educated, with the faint trace of a New England accent that spoke of good breeding and proper schooling. Thomas nodded, suddenly tongue-tied in the presence of this composed woman who had traveled halfway across the country to marry a stranger. "Welcome to Cedar Falls," he managed. "I hope the journey wasn't too difficult." Sarah glanced back at the coughing passenger, who was now being helped toward the hotel by Cal Peterson. "I'm afraid your fellow traveler has taken ill during the journey. He should be isolated immediately and given cool compresses for the fever." The casual authority in her voice when discussing medical matters sent a surge of hope through Thomas's chest. This woman truly did have experience with sickness, and she hadn't even flinched at the mention of fever. "I'll see to it," Thomas promised. "But first, let me help you with your belongings." Sarah had brought only 2 bags, both practical leather satchels that looked well-traveled. As Thomas reached for the larger one with his good hand, Sarah stepped closer, lowering her voice. Sheriff Mitchell, I must be honest with you about my circumstances. The letter I sent didn't tell you everything, and you deserve to know the truth before we proceed with any arrangements. Thomas felt his stomach drop. Here it was, the revelation that would send his hopes crashing down. She was already married, or she was fleeing some scandal, or she had lied about her nursing experience. What truth? He asked quietly. Sarah looked around the empty street, taking in the boarded windows and the general air of abandonment. I'm not just a nurse, Sheriff. I trained as a physician at the Women's Medical College in Philadelphia. I'm a doctor. Thomas stared at her, certain he had misheard. A doctor? But you said in your letter. I said I had experience caring for the sick. That was true, but incomplete. Sarah's expression was guarded, as if she expected rejection or disbelief. Most men don't appreciate the idea of a wife who practices medicine. I've learned to be cautious about revealing my full qualifications. A doctor, an actual physician, had just stepped off the stage in Cedar Falls, wearing traveling clothes and claiming to be his mail-order bride. Thomas felt dizzy with the magnitude of this development. Why didn't you tell me before? He asked. Because most men would have written back to withdraw their offer, Sarah replied honestly. A wife is one thing. A wife who thinks she knows more about medicine than her husband is another matter entirely. Thomas looked at the hotel where Cal Peterson was struggling to help the sick passenger up the front steps. He thought about little Billy Henshaw's funeral, about the 47 graves on Boot Hill, about Martha's trembling hands and the constant fear that had settled over Cedar Falls like a suffocating blanket. Miss Watson, he said slowly, if you're truly a doctor, then you're not just my answer to prayer. You might be this town's salvation. Relief flickered across Sarah's features. Then you don't object to my profession? Object? Thomas almost laughed at the absurdity of the question. Ma'am, if you can help these people, I'll pin a second badge on you myself. Sarah smiled for the first time since stepping off the stage, and Thomas was struck by how the expression transformed her entire face. This was a woman who had faced challenges and overcome them, who had fought for her education and her right to practice medicine in a world that preferred women to remain silent and ornamental. In that case, Sheriff Mitchell, I believe we should discuss terms. I'll need a place to set up a medical practice, access to supplies, and your support in convincing people to accept treatment from a female physician. Whatever you need, Thomas promised without hesitation. And the marriage arrangement? Thomas felt heat rise in his cheeks again. In his excitement about her medical qualifications, he had nearly forgotten the original purpose of her journey. That's still your choice, Miss Watson. I won't hold you to any promises made through letters. If you'd prefer to simply practice medicine here without the complications of marriage, I'd understand. Sarah studied his face carefully, and Thomas found himself hoping she could see past his missing arm and his obvious desperation to the man he was trying to be. A man worthy of respect, if not love. I didn't travel this far to change my mind at the first hurdle, she said finally, but perhaps we could consider a courtship period. I'd like to know the man I'm marrying, and I suspect you'd like to know me as well. That sounds reasonable, Thomas agreed, though part of him wanted to rush to the nearest preacher immediately, afraid she might disappear if he didn't secure their arrangement quickly. The sound of violent coughing from inside the hotel reminded them both of the immediate crisis at hand. Sarah straightened her shoulders and picked up her medical bag. Shall we see to your sick passenger, Sheriff? I have a feeling this town is going to keep me quite busy. As they climbed the hotel steps together, Thomas felt something he hadn't experienced in months. Hope. Not the desperate, grasping hope of a drowning man, but the steady, confident hope of someone who had just been thrown a lifeline by capable hands. Sarah Elizabeth Watson had arrived in Cedar Falls with secrets of her own, but if her medical skills proved as real as her confidence suggested, then perhaps their unusual arrangement would benefit everyone involved. The town needed a doctor, he needed a wife, and she needed a place where her talents would be valued rather than scorned. It wasn't a conventional beginning to a marriage, but then again, nothing about life in Cedar Falls had been conventional since the fever arrived. Sometimes the most unlikely solutions turned out to be exactly what Providence had in mind. As Sarah pushed open the hotel door and stepped inside to attend to her first patient in Cedar Falls, Thomas followed close behind, already wondering what other surprises this remarkable woman might have in store for them all. 3 months later, Sarah stood in her fully equipped medical office, examining a patient who would have died just weeks earlier. The mahogany examination table gleamed under electric lights that Thomas had arranged to be installed, making Cedar Falls the first frontier town in the territory with modern medical facilities. Her discovery about the water contamination had proven more shocking than anyone imagined. Hidden documents found in Harrison Blake's possessions revealed that Consolidated Mining Company had orchestrated similar schemes in 12 other towns across Colorado, deliberately poisoning water supplies to force residents to abandon valuable mining claims. The federal investigation led to arrests of company executives in Denver and Chicago. Sarah's meticulous medical records became key evidence in a landmark case that changed territorial law regarding corporate responsibility for public health. Her testimony before a congressional committee in Washington made national headlines as the lady doctor who exposed the mining conspiracy. But fame held little appeal for Sarah. She preferred the quiet satisfaction of watching Cedar Falls rebuild itself into a thriving community. The population had grown to over 800 as word spread about the town, with the remarkable female physician who had saved them all. Thomas found his own reputation transformed. No longer seen as the broken widower who had lost his arm in a mining accident, he was now respected as the sheriff who had stood against corruption and won. His missing limb became a symbol of survival rather than defeat, especially when he demonstrated his skill with a revolver that few two-handed men could match. Their relationship had deepened through shared trials in ways that normal courtship never could have achieved. Sarah had seen Thomas at his most vulnerable, racked with guilt over the deaths he couldn't prevent. Thomas had witnessed Sarah's fierce determination to heal everyone, even those who had tried to harm her. The morning of their planned wedding ceremony, Sarah received an unexpected visitor. Dr. Margaret Whitman from the Philadelphia Women's Medical College had traveled across the country to meet the graduate who had single-handedly exposed a criminal conspiracy while establishing a frontier medical practice. "The college wants to offer you a position," Dr. Whitman explained over tea in Sarah's office. "You could return to Philadelphia, teach other women, influence medical education policy. Your work here has opened doors that have been closed to female physicians for decades." Sarah considered the offer seriously. Philadelphia represented everything she had worked toward during her medical training: recognition, respect, the opportunity to advance women's roles in medicine on a national scale. "It's a remarkable opportunity," she admitted to Thomas that evening as they walked through the town square, now bustling with healthy families enjoying the cool mountain air. Thomas felt his heart clench, remembering how his first 2 wives had been taken from him by forces beyond his control. But this was different. Sarah wasn't being taken by death or disease, but by the very success she had earned through her own talents. "You should consider it," he said carefully. "This town will always be grateful for what you've done, but you've given us more than we could ever repay. Your future shouldn't be limited by our needs." Sarah stopped walking and turned to face him fully. "Thomas Mitchell, are you trying to convince me to leave you?" "I'm trying to be fair to you," he replied. "You came here as a mail-order bride, to a desperate man in a dying town. Now you're a renowned physician with opportunities most doctors would envy. I won't be the anchor that holds you back from greatness." Sarah stepped closer, placing her hand over his heart. "What if I told you that my greatest achievement isn't the medical discovery or the congressional testimony or the job offers? What if I told you it's finding a partner who values my mind as much as my medical skills, who supports my work even when it means personal sacrifice?" Thomas covered her hand with his own. "I'd say that makes one of us pretty lucky." "Both of us," Sarah corrected. "I'm not going to Philadelphia, Thomas. My work is here, with you, building something that matters." Dr. Whitman was disappointed, but not surprised by Sarah's decision. "I suspect this won't be the last offer you receive," she warned. "Your reputation will only grow." "Then I'll face those decisions when they come," Sarah replied. "Right now, Cedar Falls needs me, and I need Cedar Falls." The wedding took place on a sunny November afternoon in the newly constructed community church. Sarah wore a dress of ivory silk that Mrs. Rodriguez had ordered specially from Denver, while Thomas wore his best black suit with his sheriff's badge polished to mirror brightness. The entire town attended, including several territorial officials, who had come to witness the marriage of the famous lady doctor and the sheriff who had helped her save Cedar Falls. Even Garrett Mills, the typhoid patient who had been Sarah's first case in town, returned for the ceremony. As they exchanged vows, Sarah thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. She had left Boston, fleeing the constraints of a society that saw educated women as threats rather than assets. Chicago had offered anonymity, but not purpose. Only in Cedar Falls had she found a place where her skills were not just tolerated, but desperately needed. Thomas thought about the letter he had written in loneliness and desperation, never imagining it would bring him not just a wife, but a partner who would transform his understanding of what marriage could be. Sarah wasn't just someone to share his burdens, but someone who brought her own strength to their partnership. After the ceremony, as the celebration continued into the evening, Sarah and Thomas slipped away to their new home, a house they had built together on the hill overlooking Cedar Falls. The building incorporated both a modern medical office and comfortable living quarters, symbolizing the blending of their professional and personal lives. Standing on their front porch, watching the lights of the restored town twinkle below them, Sarah reflected on how much had changed since that desperate day when she had stepped off the stagecoach into an unknown future. "Any regrets?" Thomas asked, wrapping his arm around her waist. Sarah leaned into his warmth, feeling completely at peace for the first time in years. "Only that it took a plague and a conspiracy to bring us together. We could have saved ourselves some drama." Thomas chuckled. "Where's the adventure in that?" "D." As winter settled over Cedar Falls, Sarah established a medical school to train frontier nurses and midwives, recognizing that one doctor couldn't serve the growing population of the entire region. Her students came from as far as California and Texas, drawn by the opportunity to learn from someone who had proven that dedication and skill mattered more than traditional expectations. Thomas expanded his law enforcement role, working with territorial authorities to prevent other communities from falling victim to corporate schemes like the one that had nearly destroyed Cedar Falls. His investigation methods became models for rural sheriffs throughout the West. Together, they had created something neither could have achieved alone. Sarah had found a place where her medical expertise was valued without reservation. Thomas had discovered that losing his arm hadn't made him less of a man, but had prepared him to appreciate a partner who brought her own completeness to their relationship. The mail-order bride arrangement that had brought them together became a love story that transformed not just their lives, but the life of an entire community. Cedar Falls prospered under their combined leadership, growing into a model town where progress and tradition, medicine and law enforcement worked together to create something extraordinary. Their story spread throughout Colorado Territory and beyond, inspiring other communities to value the contributions of educated women and proving that sometimes the most unconventional solutions led to the most remarkable outcomes. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.